Year after year, the World Schools Debating Championship gathers the best debaters from around the globe. This year's pandemic made that impossible, so we took it online. In this style of debate, there are two teams. The proposition team, which is in favor of the motion, and the opposition team, which is against it. Each side features 3 speakers giving 4 speeches. The first 2 speakers generally present constructive argumentation. The third primarily focuses on refutation, while the reply speaker summarizes the debate. For the prepared rounds, teams research the motions for weeks in advance. For the impromptu rounds, teams have only 1 hour to prepare after being told the motion.
connection. I don't hear you correct. Is that only me or?
I can't hear properly either.
Okay.
Check your connection again.
Okay, I might have to turn off my video. Just give me 1 second. Can you guys hear me now?
A little better.
Say something longer.
Well, sorry, just 1 second. Okay, it should be fixed now. Is this okay?
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, sounds really good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so timing, do you need me to time for you? Do you want me to clap or are you fine timing yourselves?
I think we're fine timing ourselves.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Cool. Well, then if there are no other issues, we can invite Proposition 1 to begin the debate.
Hello, I can see that Amelia Warren.
Okay, I'm here. Can you hear me?
What can I do for you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Give me 1 second. So first, what is the structure? I'm going to give you a small roadmap of my speech. So first, I'm going to tell you the definitions. Then I move on to my mechanism, burden, and then onto my first argument, that of the environment, and then onto my second argument, the best agent of action. So the only definition that we have is leasing, which is a contract where a person is granted land for a specified time. Our mechanism is layered. So we will have complete seizure of land, and the list is it's leased under the following rules and 3 categories. First, houses and buildings that already exist. We propose to redistribute these properties on the basis of need, income, availability, and size. And people like in socioeconomic status will have a priority. These criteria of leasing land will be based principally in necessity. So you identify how many people need that house or how many people will live in that house, and then you determine who will live there. So this is sustainable because the government will subsidize these resources, and those who already own homes will be in jeopardy of moving, but that the government will be acting as a landlord, redistributing these lands, determining on it. Secondly, industry and factories, right? Like factories will have to abide by a set of specific rules to get land concessions, including very strict environmental regulations and the proposals of the intent of the land usage, such that they have to be community-based. And secondly, the established companies have to undergo a process of review whether they can keep their land. And thirdly, the resources unused that are not used, right? These lands would be leased on the same terms of environmental concerns as well as what is the intent of the use. And now the burden of our debate is to prove on our side we will better first solve the housing crisis in the status quo, second, tackle inequality through the destruction of the means of production, and 3, address the climate emergency, which leads me to my first argument, that of the environment. In this argument, we will prove to you when the government leases out the land, we tackle the imminent environmental issues that have long been ignored. Why? Because in the status quo, we are facing a climate crisis, which is the result of our current economical system. Large corporations are responsible for over 71% of the carbon emissions and are largely, unchecked in the status quo, stepping over locals and exploiting local communities. When we implement this measure, we fix one of the most important problems within the status quo, because in principle, we think that there is a problem with the concept of ownership. Because when you own something within the status quo, you think that you're entitled to do whatever you want with it. Entities feel justified in abusing resources that are their property because the government gives you permission to do whatever you want with that property. Yes.
Were these pieces of land will be granted to everyone for free, even companies and individuals?
Yes, they will be granted to properties and individuals, but they have to fulfill the strict standards that we establish. Now, onto I was talking about these companies have the concept of property, and when they own this, they can exploit them. We think that in the moment in which we remove the concept of ownership, what happens if we have an alternative of the evaluation of land, right? Like understanding that land sold usage is no longer profit, but focused on respecting and preserving its value, it shifts towards a human principle of preservation, right? Because we think that this valuation of land as a human concept is not only key towards creating an environmentally conscious world amongst the imminent doom, but a further coexistence of collective agency. Have this word, please. The collective agency that we create when people are no longer entitled to exploit these resources. But now to the practical side. First, we get to corporations in the status quo. There is no incentive for them to take measurements on the environmental conservation, right? There are no checks and balances for their actions because they are protected by a bubble of wealth and power. When we implement this motion, we create the agency to care and to take action. Why? Because we no longer have these FDA agencies that will be checking on their terms because they own the land. Now the government owns the land, and therefore the regulations can be much effectively applied because it's no longer on their terms. We own the land, and if they don't fulfill their duty, then they will face the consequences. And this so on our side, when there used to be like no checks and balances for these corporations, we create a system of accountability because we force them to care. We force them to care and to change this concept of property. So even if opposition argues that because land has been an important role in the community, people will take better care of it, that is less likely because if people did in fact take care of land, we wouldn't be having a climate crisis right now. So now to my second argument, that of why the government is the best actor. So in this argument, we will prove to you why the government involvement and centralization of land is principally justified and better than any other alternative. Why? Because in principle, the government is part of the social contract, right? With that established relationship, the government has a responsibility to act accordingly to what is best for the people. There is a duty to serve the citizens, but in this status quo, it has proved ineffective. This sense of accountability is something that the corporations do not have, and therefore makes the government a much better actor. What happens when we give the power to the government? The government isn't looking for profit, but to serve the public and the interest, or at least have certain responsibility that in the comparative, the companies do not, right? Also, they're the most effective actor because of the distribution policy and the effectiveness that they have on the resources. Why is this important? Because they protect the most vulnerable people from the exploitative nature of a corporate monopoly power in the moment we redefine the social responsibility and that the government has, right? And in the end, we get checks and balances because the government has an intrinsic duty to act upon the social contract and fulfill its responsibilities, something any other actor couldn't provide, even in our worst case scenario. But in the practical, we get better agency. Why? Because in the status quo, there is a centralization of power that it's not at the hands of the government, but at the hands of the corporations such as Walmart and Apple, who utilize their billions of dollars of wealth and power. So as a result, we have a corporate autocracy where governments are controlled by corporate interests. But why is this bad? Because companies have no social responsibility towards the people. And we continue to erode but secondly, because we continue to erode the public trust in the government when the people know that the largest companies and not the people who they voted for have the power. However, what happens on our side? We give the government leverage, right? The government is comparatively the best actor because they are subjective to a social contract and public pressure. The companies don't have this public pressure that make them act. So in the comparative, even in our worst case scenario, where the centralization of power performs ineffectively, we ultimately shift the power from self-interest corporations to a system that is founded upon the interest of the public, the people that we care about. We think that establishing the government's power at the core is more impactful than the harms that come as a result. Thank you very much.
Cool, thanks to that speaker. If the other adjudicators are ready, we can move on to first opposition.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, amazing. Just 1 second then. Okay. Honorable panel, fellow debaters. First of all, I'm going to do a couple of things in my speech. Firstly, I would like to rebut the arguments that Team Proposition's first speaker has shown us. Then I'm going to tell you a roadmap of our case. Then I'm going to give you two constructive arguments. So without wasting any more time, let's get into a little bit of rebuttal. Okay, now I have one huge problem with the Team Proposition's case and Team Proposition's framing is that they are basing their whole debate, their whole foundation on one huge misconception. They talked about the social contract as something that is binding, that's something that is magical, and will make sure that governments are not corrupt, that governments will do what as it is in the best interest of the public, as the speaker has numerous times said. However, then let's look at the world, ladies and gentlemen, today. The social contract is in action. However, let's look at any country. Let's look at the United States of America. Let's look at Hungary, where we are living. Let's look at China. Is the social contract binding them to be good people, to lead the country correctly? There's nothing that will make sure that what they are saying is actually true, that it will be in effect. So I believe that their whole argument, talking about how the social contract will bind these politicians and the government to act in the interest of the public, can be simply falsified by the fact that we look around and we can see that the United States of America, China, Hungary, any country where there is corruption, that this is false. So we can say that that presumption simply falsifies their argument. Okay, now let's look at so let's look at their second point, okay? Their economic argument. They talked about how the government would simply take all land and then for free give it to the people. Okay, so I have two things to say about this. Even if we agree with it theoretically and morally, which we don't because it's simply ludicrous, then let's look at it on the practical level. Let's look at the socialist bloc in Europe. Let's look at the USSR. They economically crashed. That's why they lost the Cold War, because they economically crashed, because you can see if you just take things and give them for free, then they lose their value and the government won't, and the people won't have anything to make money off. Cash flow of these lands will stop, thus causing an economic crash. Wouldn't you agree?
Who is more likely to prioritize public good? A sort of failing government or companies who literally just care about money?
Okay, thank you so much for your question. I believe that companies aren't evil, okay? Firstly, we're not only talking about agricultural land and land that you're manufacturing, we're also looking at houses and flats and places you live, apartments, all right? So that's nothing to do with companies. Those are private people's properties. First of all, who wants the public good? Okay, let's look at the social contract a little bit, okay? You talked so much about the social contract. I read it too, okay? And what it says is that it is okay to do what you want until you don't harm the other. Okay, and people also are binded by the social contract, just as the government. So according to your logic, it is not more likely that the government would be better than its people. So thank you on that. Now, I don't want to waste any more time. So let's get into our arguments. Okay, so first of all, something which Team Proposition completely had a blind eye on is that we're not only talking about industrial land, we're also talking about commercial land and residential land. This is what all land means. So if you read the motion, you can see that Team Proposition left out 2/3 of the debate in their first speech. I hope they will reflect on it in their second speech. Okay, so what is our burden as Team Opposition? This is very, very important, honorable panel. Our burden as Team Opposition is to prove to you that what Team Proposition is suggesting and proposing is worse than how things are right now. It is worse than the status quo. So we will tell you why, and we will convince you why in 4 of our arguments, 2 of which I'm going to present to you in the remaining 4 minutes of my speech. Okay, so let's talk about a very convincing first argument, Ministry of Public Land argument. Okay, so we tried to ask points of information from the first speaker about 15 times. However, they have declined. So I am asking this question from the second speaker of team proposition. I hope they do not ditch it. So in your world, leases and extensions would be awarded on the basis of what? So they would be free and for everyone and everyone who's in need. However, if you think about it a little bit, when you get free mansions, you will say, well, I am in need. And there will be 10 million people going for the best, most expensive, most beautiful house ever. So my question is, on base what will you allocate it to the people? We are making the assumption, because they didn't specify it, unfortunately, in their first speech, so we have to base it on presumptions, that it will be based on merit. Proposition would create an Orwellian dystopia with the Ministry of Public Land. It would inevitably create a big brother type of surveillance of the people and eventually deprive them from their ability to resist systematic oppression and corruption. How would this happen? Okay, so they have only talked about commercial land, all right? And they have said that these companies would be surveilled and see and would be checked how environmentally friendly they would be. And we presume, because they haven't specified it to flats and houses, which are also land, how would they be surveilled? Okay, so there's this is what we're talking about. They have already said that companies were being surveilled. However, the flats and houses won't be bought by companies. It will be bought by individuals. Maybe later, and allocated based on merit. So these people, this big brother type of surveillance would be also seen not only on companies, but also on individuals. In Proposition's model, the granting of leasing and extensions of those leases would be based on how well they fit, how much they are in accordance to what the government wants them to do. This requires an enormous administrative machinery with a vast constantly updated database that would have to link up with every other agency and even private credit agencies to update data on things like bad credit, missed payment, unacceptable behavior by the leaseholder, etc., etc. And if you look at it, it would be almost exactly like what's happening in China, the credit system. People are credited on their behavior, how well the government will just make up things like, okay, well, you are not a good leaser because you didn't do X and Y, and they will give you points and merits based on which you will get your flat, thus creating an Orwellian, with this credit system. Right now, in the status quo, information is not universally available to government agencies. Tax authorities like IRS do not have access to find information imposed by the Environmental Protection Agency. Any system where the granting of the lease to the given individual based on anything other than price and ability to pay would require this form of data integration. Okay, why is this a problem? What is the impact? Control of the government enables corruption, giving leases to friends, for example. 2, it is immoral because people have the natural right to privacy where they're allowed to make mistakes and other opportunity and have opportunity to grow from them. Thirdly, it is also harmful to the people most vulnerable, the people who are poor and do not have the money to make the lease on time and take control of their houses. These people will not get housing. It would the people close to the government who are friends with the prime minister and minister who would get the best houses. And we believe that 1, this is immoral on the principle that everyone has the right to privacy and to grow from their mistakes. And secondly, it would only enable corruption. Thank you so much for listening to my speech.
Cool. The House thanks that speaker. If the other adjudicators are ready, we can move on to Proposition 2.
Hi, I'm having connectivity issues, so I think it's best if I don't turn on my video. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, perfect. So can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Let's first start reframing this debate because of the fact that the opposition team completely negates both the motion and the proposition's case. First, in terms of what we need to defend, we think that what we need to defend as a proposition team is why we do need this restructuring of land, and second, why the government is the best person to do it. What does the opposition respond? We think that the opposition does two things that are very strategically incorrect. First, in case of taking our very worst case scenario in every single one of their refutations, talking about massive corruption in a surveillance state. But second, in terms of defending the status quo, right? Because we see that every single one of their rebuttals goes straight to their status quo and is not mutually exclusive in the moment in which they tell us we will have corrupt governments, we will have a surveillance state. We tell you, opposition team, as you told us within your refutation, look around and see that this surveillance state already exists, that this coercion and corruption is a lot worse on your side because you're doing absolutely nothing to fix it. Let's go into our mechanism where they have two refutation. First, in terms of how socialism has failed before, and second, in terms of how we didn't reference different types of land. I would just like to restate this because my proposition already told you, my first proposition already told you that we did divide land in three categories. First, in terms of residential land, which we will lease on the base of need, not on the base of merit, as the opposition places to you. Second, in terms of exploitative land, which was very, very clear. And third, in the terms of land that is not used, which we will also lease on necessity and will be subject to very, very strict environmental measurements. Now, why will this work, right? Why is this a viable mechanism? Why will this not end up as a USSR? First, in terms of context, right? We tell you that right now we have one of the strongest government agency, and we have the necessity and we have the means for huge structural change because of the fact that we are going through an era in which we have never gone through before. Second, in terms of this idea that this really is different, right? Because we still have this same government structure in which the government can still have the agency, in which we still have a party that is elected and re-elected, in which we still have a government which is subject to the public good. This is why we still win on our mechanism. But let's go into our arguments. Where first they critique our first argument, we have no response to our first argument on the environment, right? We tell you within your status quo that you're doing absolutely nothing to defend. We see a world in which in 10 years we will die, right? We see a world in which we have a very, very huge impending doom as the human race. We see you do nothing to fix it. We see that we do fix this huge structural issue that is behind this inequality in the moment in which we tell you, A, there is an intrinsic problem with ownership, and B, we have a huge issue with this idea that we have this corporatocracy, right? Let's go into this idea of ownership where we tell you entitlements, the human entitlement stemming from a hierarchization between humans and land is what has led to this continuous exploitation. Second, in terms of government leverage, we tell you the government now has some power to take away from these state corporations, right? So when they talk to us about corruption in our second argument and about the social contract and it not working, we tell you not only is this a worst case scenario, but comparatively, when we're talking about curbing corporate power, we think that what we happen is we decrease corruption because of the fact that we no longer have corporate interests controlling our government officials. We prefer for these officials to be corrupt on their own, for them to be serving this higher purpose of literally exploitation that is not only leading to our death, but a huge structural inequality, which is our third argument, which I will go into right now, in which we will prove to you how implementing this measure targets structural issues behind inequality. Why? Because we think inequality is rooted in the possession of the means of production. This means that those who own capital, land, and resources have the ability to exploit those who do not because of the way they make money. We think that this is based on the ownership of property. And in the status quo, this has translated into a massive breach between owners and workers, where the vast minority have an ability to exploit the vast majority on the basis of power and money gained by land and expanded generation after generation. This same system leads to a limitation of opportunity. When people lack the power of ownership or lack their means of production, they're subject to exploitation because they have no alternatives to earning a living, but being subject to unfair wages and exploitative work in a very majority of cases. In our mechanism, we propose to redistribute land to create a basis of equal opportunity. And on our side, in the moment in which we redistribute land, we reallocate sources of wealth that root this inequality, because we begin to receive benefits of having homes, resources, and opportunities. On principle, why is this good? Before I go into this, I can take a POI.
So if there are thousands of people lining up for a very high quality house, who would you give it to? The one who is the poorest, or based on what merit would you give a residential house to someone?
We tell you since the beginning that we will have various criteria to decide this, not only on the basis of need, but on the basis of family side, on the basis of location, on the basis of necessity, right? We tell you that we really don't think that this is a huge issue that this motion is trying to solve, right? We tell you that what we do focus on is this idea that we have a lack of distribution of effective resources, right? We think that this is a problem that we try to solve as an op. We see little to no refutation from the opposition side. So on principle, why is this measure good? We think that shelter is a bare minimum for quality of life. So having a place to sleep, rest, and store your belongings provides security, safety, and a livelihood that is inherent to the human condition and necessary to being able to provide yourself with able sustenance. And in the status quo, we place the rights to quality of life to the standard of income, where people die on the streets simply because they cannot earn enough money. We think that this is hugely problematic because the human condition is reduced to a monetary sum, but we undermine the idea that humans have a natural right to a certain quality of life. This is hugely problematic on the opposition side. On the proposition side, we see that we begin to change this because in the status quo, over 500 million people in the US live like this. We think this is outrageous, especially because 7 million homes are vacant. So we understand that the system is not working correctly right now, but we do fix it because we think that this is a problem of distribution of resources, right? And on our
Vale, you cut off.
Hello? Is the speaker still there?
I think she's having a connection issue. Let me check. Okay, she's reconnecting. Could we wait like for a minute just so she can reconnect?
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
I've stopped the timer on 7 minutes 25 seconds. Amelia, Jason.
Yeah.
I have a similar time left. Last thing she said was the vacancy in the US.
Perfect.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I had a connectivity issue, but I'm here.
Don't worry. So we have your time at about 7:25.
Okay.
Okay, and the last thing you were speaking about was vacancies in the US.
Okay, perfect. I'll finish really fast. Okay. On our side, we think that we begin to shift a problematic schematic of inequality because opportunities begin to become equalized and are no longer dependent on money. This means that structural violence stemming from land ownership begins to reverse, and access to resources and basic rights is no longer on the basis of privilege. What's changes? We have equal opportunity because we do have a greater sense of equality. An intrinsic disadvantage of land ownership is reversed because we see this that in the case of Finland, in the moment in which homeless people were given a home, they had now the ability to create a job and a livelihood simply when they got a house. We think that this is comparatively huge because we counter the root of a system responsible for massive suffering and bleeding into so much inequality worldwide. What do we tell you as a prop? We change three things: the environment, the government, and inequality. So really vote for the side that begins to change the schematic that hurts so many people worldwide, that begins to change a world in which in 10 years we will all be obsolete. Thank you.
One second.
Sorry,
Okay.
thanks for that speech. We can move on to up to.
Can you give me a timer, please? Yes, I'm getting a timer. 1 second. Okay, I'd like to start. I'll start in a few seconds. So the government is the worst possible person you can give your house to for several reasons. They can be corrupt. They have no incentive to renovate it, and they will follow you on what basis you do, and they will evaluate you based on their criteria. And this is why we are so proud to oppose. So a previous speaker has told you that the government can be corrupt, and in fact is. It's not something which is necessarily enabled by this model. It is something which already exists and will be implanted perfectly into their world. And they did not even try to set up an agency or whatever to mitigate this corruption. Now, before I move on, I'd like to start with some rebuttal before I move on to my substantive, which will address environment and other social issues. So, firstly, they talked about the environment. But they did not tell us how they would monitor it. Will CCTV cameras be put onto your gate to watch you when you plow your plants and when you feed your animals? There is nothing logical to their side. How can you monitor whether someone actually does something good for the environment? And how can you stop them from exploiting their land in the last possible moment? Let's say when your 10-year contract is about to land and you would want to cut out all trees, everything on that piece of land, if you can still make some profit from it. What would stop people from doing that? Because maybe there is some monitoring while somebody is using their land. What will happen towards the end of the contract? We think they will destroy the land with unsustainable practices, which could still, at the very end of the contract, which is much, much worse on their side. So they also said the government is the best actor for change. But I'd like to highlight here that would you trust the government of China or other governments to monitor their citizens in a fair way and then give out land to people who most need it? And also, they base their idea on the social contract, which is completely a myth because the society, the government, is made up of humans too, who went there for a specific interest, which is mostly money. This is made up of humans as well. And the good thing is that when companies, at least they compete against other companies, and when you limit their traction, they will not be they will be just as they will be much more dangerous to put all that company power into state power, because there is nothing there to balance out state power. There's nothing there to balance state power because the state will be there. The only thing it will rely on is votes, but even that's very much manipulated. No, thank you. Without other companies stepping in and showing that there are problems. So a specific problem which I'd like to point out on their side is that they're giving this for free, all land for free. And you know what? That's problematic because everyone will line up to want to live in the White House, for example, and you would give that for someone who is the most, deserving based on your conditions. But it'll be creating chaos because if you want to give away the land of museums, of parliament buildings, of office buildings, it is just going to turn into complete chaos because you're forcing people who are actually not that needy, richer people, to live in the worst possible places, and that will be just create anger and exploitation. It'll be the worst possible situation to live in. And also, they would monitor how well you take care of your house or what situations you'll be granted your next house. But that is unfair in its nature as well, because if companies are richer, they're much more likely to try to be able to keep these standards. Also, they would limit corporations. They would take away the land of corporations and give it to other corporations. What I'd like to emphasize here today, the reason why we are even having this online tournament is because of companies that are unsustainable, from Zoom to whatever. If we take away their land, there will be no Zoom, there'll be no Apple, there'll be no iPhone. If you take away their land, they'll have to find a new place to sustain themselves. But if they're not a sustainable company, like Apple, for example, is not, then all of what we know of society, or most electronic companies are not sustainable, will be lost at this moment. All of what we know about today's society will be lost because they will inherently will not be getting land. And the final point, which they talked about, is that people not having a house and why that is so bad. And we agree that they're so bad, but they don't understand the real reason why there aren't that many houses today is because there aren't enough houses being built. So if you just redistribute it and put the poorest into the richest houses and the richest people in the poorest houses because no one wants to apply for those houses, that will still be people without a house. And you know what happens on our side? People are incentivized to build houses. On their side, no one is incentivized to build houses for the government for free. If they get no return, there's no reason why anyone would like to build a house. And unless you assume that the government has unlimited resources to build houses for everything, there is no point of their argumentation, and it fails on that point. But before I move on, I'd like to take your point of information now.
Even if corrupt, who is better? The government that has a duty to the people, or real estate companies who strip people of their houses and who don't pay rent and don't give them a place to live?
So the government having a duty to the people, yes, that may exist, but that's not what happens in practice. And also maybe some companies are exploitative and are not good. But there always are others who are good. They compete against each other. They have to show their virtues in order to be the competitive winner. And when there's no one to balance out the government, then that is the most dangerous situation they can possibly be in. If you take away their land and their resources, that is the most dangerous thing you can have for society. There'll be no one to produce your day-to-day life activities. There'll be no one to even be a complementary element of power to the government. But to their environmental arguments, I'd like to add another environmental argument, which is perverse incentives of destroying other people's house. So let's say there's made a mistake, some kind of minor environmental harm on your land. Let's say there is abundance of dangerous chemicals on your piece of land. You'd obviously not get another piece of land because you will become an unsustainable company. Now, what this incentive it creates is that for me or anyone else to secrete hazardous chemicals into someone else's land, because in that way they will not be able to receive their land again, and you could be one of those who has it. Let me explain this mechanism better. So there's a piece of land, and people are applying. There's intense competition for that piece of land, which is owned by a corporation. If you go over there and destroy environmentally that person's land, then it's very likely that that person with that land will not be able to have that house again. You're going to destroy your other people's competition by destroying their land environmentally. And this has twofold impacts. Firstly, it's entirely unfair for companies' competition. And secondly, it creates environmental problems because the incentive to environmentally destroy other people's land in order to be able to get that land yourself. And that is much worse than the status quo, because in the status quo, no one is incentivized to environmentally destroy your land by chemicals or by other ways, because there is nothing to gain from that. Now, my second argument, which I'd like to move into, is that economic argument about no development and maintenance. Now, I've already touched on this, but I'd like to explain today that the economic incentive to take care of a house will be lost on their side. So what happens in the status quo? People have an economic incentive to develop a house or an apartment because they can buy a derelict house, renovate it with their own style, and sell it for more money. Now, what happens on their side? Nobody has incentive or even the possibility to put money into their house because it's not theirs. There is no promise to do this. There's no incentive because of no profit, because the state will ultimately have that house. And the only one who could renovate a place would be the state to make decisions about this. Now, the problem here is that when you have no incentive to create a nice house in your own design, if that's not your priorities, as they not mentioned, then the economic industry, the development of the housing industry will fail at its point. So the problem here is that even if the government will be doing it, they will not have the resources to make fascinating buildings which ultimately attract in other economic developments. So some people see opportunity, their own style, and put it on the market with a different look. They will not have houses deteriorating, but on their side, there'll be no one who wants to refurbish their house. They'll just put it in their worst condition. No one will buy it and create a new house. That would be much worse than the status quo. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks for that speech. If the other adjudicators are ready, we can move on to Proposition 3.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So let me set the timer and I'll begin. In the status quo, in the average country, a person who earns the minimum wage would need to work 50 years to be able to buy a house. In many countries, this would be 70% of the population. This tragical scenario that happens, it happens just because when we manage land, profit is a main incentive, and we put it over the public need, we put it over the most needed, we put it over our own people. That is what we want to change, and that is what the opposition hasn't been able to prove why it is wrong. Before I start with the points of clash, I do want to say that the opposition is acting in this completely conspirative world where they talk about massive surveillance, super big corruption, where they talk about like competitively attacking the other people's land. We do believe that this scenario is super unrealistic, and therefore majority of the refutation falls flat, but we will act on it to show you how it is more likely to happen on their side. So what are the points of clash during this debate? We believe that the main problem that we need to answer during this motion is who gets the better resource or land distribution and management for everybody and in the benefit of everybody. To explain this, we have three main points. Who is the best manager? And here's where we clash between the government versus like private owners in the majority companies. Secondly, who has a responsible use of this land and resources? Here's where we clash between like the owners whose main incentive is like their private incentives versus being subject to a lease where you need to fulfill certain regulations. And thirdly, who gets more accessibility for the general population to this land, who at the end everyone should be able to access. And here's where we clash between us, who will say we should divide it on need and what is most beneficial for the country, versus they who say like we should divide it on who has more economic power to buy it, which is the status quo since the beginning they established they wanted to debate that. But now to our first point of clash on who is the best manager. Here we tell you that even with the worst governments, we believe that with something as basic as land, it is the best thing to have a manager who at least needs to justify their action on basis of being fulfilling a public need. Here's where we act. Look, even if they won't fulfill the social contract 100% as they want to tell us, at least they need to justify publicly their actions. So some of their actions need to be based on public need, opposed to the status quo where a company literally needs to say, I made no harms to anybody, but yeah, all my incentives are profit and I won't benefit anybody. So how does their status quo look like? The majority of land, both on terms of resources and housing, is based on private interest and many times companies, and is managed by these companies. No, thank you. We tell you that the fact that companies control so much is detrimental for many reasons. Firstly, they have so much power and leverage that regulations are almost impossible because they control all this land. But secondly, and here's where we clash with their point of corruption, corruption is way easier on their side because companies are so overpowered that governments end up being dependent on them and end up being obliged to comply with their demands. However, what happens on our side, even with corruption could still happen on our side and be very, very nasty, we tell you that the government has more power over companies because it gains the leverage. This is something that both Ale and Valentina explained to you. We tell you that when the government gains more power and leverage over companies, they slowly become less dependent on companies, and therefore companies lose leverage and lobbying power. Therefore, we believe that corruption could possibly decrease on our side, even if at the beginning we could still have it. But on their side, companies are so overpowered and and with so much leverage that it would never decrease. So we win on that point. Secondly, we tell you even with when we had corruption, we believe that our main benefits come with this point. When the government is the main manager of something as basic as land, a government will be obliged to comply with the public good on the social contract. And we tell you again, even when the social contract was super dysfunctional, as it is in our worst case scenario, that is the only scenario that they play in, at least the government is forced to justify it on those bases. So if I am to construct, to build like a factory, or if I am to build, I don't know, a church or whatever I am to lease my land to or build, I need to justify it on basis of the public good, which means that minimally those governments would have to at least make some of their actions directed to the public good, something that already happens on the status quo with corrupt governments, just so they get reelected. That's their incentive. But when you have more agency, when it is on land, and your actions are at least to some degree directed to public good, we believe that the benefits that the majority of the population gets are way greater than in the status quo, where companies, they don't need to justify to be doing something good for the population. They just need to justify that they are not killing anybody, which we believe that even on our worst case scenario, where they won't always make the best thing for the population, we're better off than on their side. And then they come with the super big bother crazy point of surveillance. We firstly tell you surveillance is very unlikely to happen in every country, simply because if surveillance was to happen, we would see it with the law. What happens in China is that they have surveillance to ensure that the law is applied to like the way that they want it to. We would see that in every country if it was possible to happen in every country, simply with governments surveilling that you applied their laws, or you would go to jail. We believe that it's super unrealistic that it would happen in every country, simply because in the status quo it only happens in a few, and we would take that if we get all of our extra benefits that they don't. But we tell you, even when we play in our worst case scenario, we tell you let's surveil companies, because in many cases they do damage your population, and we're tired of it. But now to our second point of responsible use. And here's where we tell you, like, no, thank you. In the status quo, we constantly have companies exploiting our resources, and we can't stop we can't stop them right now with the regulations that we have. But when you condition their leases, and therefore their entire production, and respecting and fulfilling environmental and research regulations, then it's way more likely that we at least have a chance of having a future. The first thing that we tell you is profit is no longer their incentive. In the status quo, they want to exploit land as much as they want, as they can, because they want profit. They want to extract as much oil as they want. They want to produce as much clothes as they want as they need in their factory, and therefore keep on contaminating. But when we tell them, like, unless you fulfill those regulations, which can apply both to the environment and to the like conditions that you have your workers, unless you fulfill them, we won't give you your factory back. We won't give you your source of profit back. Then their incentive is to attend to those regulations. And we also tell you that on their point of maintenance, we can also condition that. We can tell them either you give it back as we gave it to you, or you won't get it again. So the richest are maintaining their things. We're the only ones who are able to maintain it right now, because the poor people are literally too worried about getting something on their plate to maintain their land, right? We tell you, like, you know what? The rich will keep on having this incentive to maintain, because otherwise we will take their house or their business, and the poor will at least have the government responsible for maintaining their houses in good conditions, because the government is the owner, right? So the government has an incentive to keep good quality of life to the poor, right? We also tell you that on responsible use, we at least get some agency to regulate, and we at least have the government prioritizing development that impacts nationally and internally, rather than having companies who are multinational and exploit our resources but never give back to the country. So at the end of the day, we do tell you that not only do we prove to you the best actor is the government, but secondly, we tell you we give you a better environmental management and more accessibility for the poor, because now we divide on need, not on profit. Thank you.
Cool. If the other adjudicators are ready, we can move on to opposition 3.
Okay. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Thank you. And I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Honorable panel and fellow debaters, I will start by talking about the 4 clash points which I have identified in today's debate, and then move on to our comparative. So, what was the first clash point of today's debate? Well, I believe it was corruption. We told you that the propositions model requires an immense amount of surveillance to see what was the precedent for people of how they have used their land, or every other, or how much needs they have, requires looking at people's incomes, looking at where they have come from, and looking at several different factors which we think enables corruption. How? Well, first of all, yes, it enables corruption because the people who will be choosing between the different people applying for the said house will be there standing, making the choice. And if these people are actors of the state, we believe that they will have an incentive to choose people who are friendly towards the state. And this, in and of itself, is already a problem if the state is corrupt. However, we have told you that even if we were to assume that everything is fine and that the state isn't corrupt at all, we still are faced with the problem that our first speaker addressed, that this is primarily immoral because we do not have the right to such obstruction of privacy, as she has said. And second of all, it hurts the most vulnerable the most. No, thank you. The people who simply do not have the money to pay leases on time, do not have the access to such money to take care of their house in the way that the other side has talked about. So even if we accept that the state wasn't, for example, corrupt, then we still, our 2 points still stand, that it is simply immoral and that the most vulnerable will be hurt under the propositions model. The second clash point was about the environment. They told us that people will have to, that companies will have to submit environmentally friendly plans. However, our second speaker has told you that this presents 2 different problems. First of all, the idea that this cannot necessarily be surveillance. And if it isn't surveillance, then we are led to this greenwashing and kind of the idea of this fake companies pretending that they are doing something good for the environment when they are actually not. We believe that this is comparatively worse than in the status quo, because now, at least, no thank you, we actually know when a company is environmentally friendly, and because we are not, as the other side said, forcefully making them do this, but they are doing this by their own ideas, and this is much better on our side. And also, we have told you that even if we accept their idea, this incentivizes exploitation. Why? Because if you know that there is another person who is also applying, another company also applying for the same land, we are ultimately left with people on their moral ground might not think about other people and think only about what is good for themselves, and thus this incentivizes them to do something that makes the other people applying look worse. But before I move on, yes.
In the status quo, greenwashing already happens. However, on our side, companies would forcibly be subject to a revision that ensures that they are not greenwashing. Otherwise, they won't get their land back.
So what we see here is the problem that this we do not believe can be surveillance, and secondly, that this creates the incentive for exploitation, something that is very inherent to their side. So the exploitation idea is that companies would now do something not for the good of themselves, not making themselves look better, but take the very easy and enabled way out of making something of, for example, polluting the other companies' plants or their records or something, and thus making them unable to apply for a new land. Also, we believe that this creates the problem that companies will ultimately fail, because as our second speaker I've told you, not all companies are generally deemed sustainable. No, thank you. And this creates the problem that if the company isn't sustainable but is necessarily useful for the public, is necessarily providing something for a cheap price, these companies, like for example Apple, will be gone. And this is a problem for the most vulnerable, who will, no thank you, who do not have the money to afford the environmentally friendly or necessarily costing more products. And it creates a mass amount of bankruptcy on different companies, which is already a problem. So onto the 4th clash point of why don't people have houses and what is the current problem in the status quo. No, thank you. So the other side explained that this is because minorities are being exploited. Minorities are exploiting the majority. And this is why people don't have houses. However, we believe that there is already social things in place, social legislation enabling some redistribution. And we think that the primary problem is not that, it is that we do not have simply enough houses. There is a housing crisis in places like Copenhagen. So even if you have the money, you still do not have access to a normal home. And why? And this can only be solved on our side because we have the incentive for people to actually build houses. And this is really important because a whole industry, the renovation industry, relies upon this. And thus we believe that renovation would completely cease to exist on their side. So Your Honor, I would like to ask, what happens to those houses that are deteriorating in value and people are not renovating them? Because simply, why would you renovate something that is not yours and that will not bring you any profit in the future?
But before you move on,
those houses will be no, thank you. Well, those houses will be left untouched and they will deteriorate in value continuously, thus, in the end, ceasing to be a house habitable completely. And on the fourth idea of the company versus government and who should be holding this sort of ownership. Well, they said that companies are bad because they do not have any social pressure, and that the government is good because it simply does. Well, we've explained several points to this. First of all, that not all companies are bad, however, and they do actually have social pressure because they have the incentive to make the best of whatever land they have, because that is simply how they get profit. And this is extremely important because if the companies don't have this sort of incentive, that is when we get this sort of bankruptcy, and that is when we do not get the lands utilized the best. And also, they talked about the idea of the government. However, we have told you that companies are actually, and the fact that companies have this sort of power actually balances out the state. Why? Because if we assume that on their side, the state will not only be owning all land, but will be a control of the people and will only be changed by the wants of the people, that is when we get the problem of the state simply having too much power, which even if it doesn't lead to corruption, is inherently immoral, as we have told you, and it is dangerous for the most vulnerable. Now, onto our comparative. So I believe that this can be boiled down to one question. We are 7:30. To one single question: what is the public good? So we believe that the public good is when everyone actually has the opportunity to a house, because that is what happens on our side. There is the opportunity to buy a house, and there is some sort of social implementations in place. However, everyone has the opportunity to actually buy the house they actually want, for example, and that is within their price range. They have the opportunity to renovate their house, for example. We also think it is good because government is being overseen and that companies also have power, and thus there is checks and balances, which ceases to exist on their side. And also companies are more productive and most providing for the people and providing what they need. On their side, all they have is chaos and reliant on one factor. And this is why I was proud to oppose. Thank you. My timer kept switching off, so that's why I kind of overdid. Yeah.
Cool. If the other adjudicators are ready, we can move on to our reply.
So, what happened in this debate? Proposition brought us a case based entirely on the social contract, which I've showed you is non-existent, which puts the proposition in an extremely difficult situation. They brought us three arguments. One on the environment, the other ones are strengthening the government is so good and cracking down on companies. Another idea about people finally having a house. And let's address environment first. So there, on our side at least, there's an incentive. So if we vote you, that in their side, companies will have an incentive to destroy other companies' land by introducing chemicals there, chemical fertilizers, making them look unenvironmentally friendly, thus putting them in a better competitive position to gain that land. And we think this is fundamental harms of destroying the environment by destroying each other's land is much worse than today's world, but at least people don't have an incentive to go out there and destroy other people's land. They talked about strengthening the government, but we fear surveillance because the only way that people can monitor other people's land is by the government constantly checking what you do with this. Secondly, they told us about crackdown on companies. I'll tell you again, most companies are unsustainable today. If you take away the land of Zoom, Apple, whatever, you'll be left with nothing which we have of our society, our civilization today. They said they would shift corruption from companies. At least companies won't be corrupt, but then the state can be corrupt, yes, but that's still better than companies. I'd like to emphasize that shifting corruption from one side to another is not better because the state spends your money. At least when companies are corrupt, they spend the money which they earned by creating a product. They earned it fairly. When the state is corrupt, they are corrupt with your own money which you gave them. And lastly, they talked about people having a house. But let's imagine the state were not corrupt at all. Even then, our side tells you that the truth is that the housing crisis is caused by lack of houses. Now, what happens if nobody wants to build a house because that's ultimately not yours? No, it's the state's house. If nobody builds a house for you, then there'll be no way to solve the housing crisis in the first place. So no one to renovate your house. So I'd like to emphasize that the harms they cause are state surveillance, state corruption, spending your own money, environmental harm, gaining a competitive advantage by destroying other people's house. These harms are something which our side does not have, which puts us ultimately for the win. So the idea which we want this debate is about development and maintenance. So on their side, if no one can gain money from developing areas, who will develop a house in the first place? Who will renovate a house? Because in the status quo, people can buy a derelict house, rebuild it, make it better with their own style in the central district, having it looking really nice. If no one does that, because no one will earn money from it, then those houses will go into worse condition, and it's up to the state whether they want to rescue that house or not. We will create amazing buildings which attract economic development with it if no one can gain on it. And dear judge, this has much more implications than you would think. Because there will be no houses built because no one will be incentivized to build them unless the state has unlimited money, let's imagine. Secondly, there will be no maintenance of houses. Thirdly, they will be destroyed by competitors who want to make the other company look environmentally not friendly. We think all these sides make us on the much stronger side. So dear panel, a ballot for our side is a ballot for not systematically destroying the environment by destroying other people's airland. A vote for us is a vote for development, the possibility to develop into a country which has many people, which has houses built, has a nice city centre, has investment to making the place look better and more livable for people. Our side supports people having a house. We don't support the government watching you. We don't think the government crackdown on companies, crackdown and surveillance is a solution to this. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks to that speaker. And now for prop reply.
Okay. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. Our Orwellian dystopia is a dystopia in which we begin to change the very structures that will lead to our demise, in which we actually begin to change the very principles that have shaped a society in which there are some at the top, some at the bottom, and in which if we do not change in 10 years, we will be in a planet that is completely inhabitable. How did this debate play out on the proposition and on the opposition side, on the principle and on the practical stance? Why does the proposition win both? Let's talk first about principles. We present to you with 3: ownership, social contract, and quality of life. Let's go into ownership, in which we tell you we have a human hierarchy in which we put land on a second place. We exist in a place in which the very concept of ownership gives people a right to exploit the very land that we live on, which has caused that if we do not change the structures in which we live in the next 10 years, as Ale tells you, we will all die, right? We tell you that what happens when we take away this ownership is we collectivize and incentivize a responsibility for coexistence and preservation. We value land as a human construct, which gives us our life. This is something that the proposition does nothing to refute. We think that this is huge because of the fact that it can save not only our lives, but humanity, right? But on the second point, on the social contract, we talk about clashing incentives. We bring to you a comparative where we talk to you about companies versus government. We ask you who has the incentive to care for the people. We tell you government, right? We tell you that we see the status quo, we see our Orwellian dystopia, and what we do see is huge mass exploitation from the part of a corporatocracy. We look outside and we see very murky skies. We see a future in which we have little to no hope because of the fact that we have allowed companies to exploit our people and to exploit our land for far too long. If no matter the cost it takes, we take it on the proposition side because we do think that we have a claim to this change. And third, in terms of quality in life, we tell you that we have a massive inequality stemming from the ownership of means of production. We have a massive breach in access to opportunities because of the fact that we do not know how to distribute our resources, because the huge problem is this distribution of resources. As we tell you, 5 million people are homeless, 7 million homes are uninhabited. We win on this principle because we tell you we have a claim, we deserve a life, right? We win and justify this motion on principle because even with no tangible impacts, we have huge net benefits. But let's go into the practical. We have the first point, corporation versus the state. We tell you we have a trade-off, right? We get much more government power and we curb corporate power. What changes in the status quo? The government actually has agency and has control and can actually help. We see the opposition team telling us it will not work, right? We tell you that we prefer for the government to actually have an incentive to step up. We think that we have a claim to changing the world in which we live in. Second, in terms of land, we ask you the question, who actually cares? We tell you what we want is for people to have consequences, right? We tell you that on our side, when we fail, right? When we make a mistake, we actually have the ability to hold people accountable because they are binded by a contract, right? We choose survival and we will continue to choose it. So in our worst case scenario, right? Let's say that nothing happens. Let's say that all our impacts are very mitigated. We think that we win. We put the human condition first. We recognize and change the structural issues that will take our lives in less than 10 years. And what we do is we take away this idea of the Orwellian dystopia, and what we bring to you is a future in which you and I can actually look forward and say, I want to live there. Vote for prop, vote for change.
Cool. Thanks to that speaker. I'm just going to ask for us to be moved, and then we'll start deliberation.
Thank you very much for adjudicating.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the debate.
Thank you.